Welcome to Skywarn and the National Incident Management System, part one of a two-part training series for Kent County Skywarn and any interested Skywarn team, looking at the National Incident Management System in part one and the Incident Command System in part two to be released after this video is published. My name is Colin McConkey, and I serve as of time of recording in October of 2024 as the Kent County Skywarn Coordinator here in Kent County, Michigan. Kent County is the fourth largest county by population within the state of Michigan, and it is home to the second largest population center currently in the state of Michigan, the city of Grand Rapids. And I am very privileged to serve as the current Kent County Skywarn Coordinator. I have an absolutely wonderful leadership team of deputy coordinators, as well as an absolutely wonderful team of trained weather spotters serving in Skywarn. So, tonight's focus, as I am currently recording it, it is evening, but regardless of what time of day you may be watching this, tonight's focus is going to be looking at Part 1, Skywarn and the National Incident Management System, or as it is frequently referred to as NIMS, as I will frequently refer to it throughout this particular video, as well as in Part 2, soon to be released, Skywarn and ICS, or the Incident Command System. So, in this particular video, we're going to look at NIMS, the National Incident Management System, and how Kent County Skywarn's operations are going to be continually aligned within the National Incident Management System. We're going to go into what it is. We're going to look at why we need to align within this structure, look at some recommended continuing education opportunities, and then look back on this video and look ahead to part 2 for the Incident Command System. But before we go any further, we need to start with some clear definitions, common terminology, which as we will learn is actually part of NIMS, and we need to ask ourselves, what is Skywarn fundamentally? What is NIMS? And what is ICS? Well, if you are watching this video, very likely you know that Skywarn is the volunteer weather spotter program created and owned by the National Weather Service. Each National Weather Service office administers Skywarn programs as they see fit, as best meets their needs. Here in West Michigan, the National Weather Service has elected that local emergency managers administer the Skywarn program at a county level. Other weather forecasting offices within the NWS may elect to have an area-wide Skywarn team rather than individual teams. They may have one larger team. It all depends on what best meets the needs for the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service is what we would call the AHJ, or the authority having jurisdiction over Skywarn. It is their program. They are the ones that have the authority to define it, to administer training, to be certified within it, and to administer it or to delegate the administration of it as they see fit. What is NIMS? NIMS, as we already know, stands for the National Incident Management System, and it provides management principles for all levels of both public sector, in other words, and also private sector incident response. In other words, for all levels of government, the federal government, state governments, and local governments, such as county and city governments, but not even only relegated to governmental structures. It can and absolutely should and indeed is used by the private sector as well, such as businesses, such as healthcare institutions. It can be used at a very local level, even within your own family or within your own church or within your own particular volunteer organization or whatever group you are part of, or even within your own personal preparedness system. The National Incident Management System is key to meeting the national preparedness goal. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. ICS, which we will only briefly touch on here, as I have stated, we will cover this in more detail in the second video to follow, stands for, as we now know, the Incident Command System. And this practically takes the principles within NIMS and applies it in a comprehensive structure for responding to incidents both large and small. Very quickly, what is an incident? An incident could be an emergency, such as an active shooter. It could be a disaster, such as a tornado or a hurricane. It could be a planned event, such as a rally for a political figure, especially as I record this now with the 2024 presidential election only days away at this point. NIMS and ICS go hand in hand with each other. NIMS provides the larger management structure and principles. ICS is the specific application and organization of those principles for incident response. So, looking specifically at NIMS this evening, as we know, it stands for National Incident Management System. What are the official definitions for NIMS? Who defines what it is? The National Incident Management System is defined by FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And FEMA has defined the National Incident Management System to be as follows, quote, "The National Incident Management System, NIMS, guides all levels of government, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector to work together to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from incidents." FEMA goes on to say, quote, "NIMS provides stakeholders across the whole community with the shared vocabulary, systems, and processes to successfully deliver the capabilities described in the National Preparedness System. NIMS defines operational systems that guide how personnel work together during incidents." End quote. Well, we understand from these basic definitions that it applies to all levels of government and all levels outside of government as well. It really applies to all levels of society for personal, community, local, state, and national preparedness. But it also raises a question because it talks about how it's a derivative from the National Preparedness System. What is the National Preparedness System? FEMA goes on to say, quote, "Experience tells us that when the whole community comes together to tackle a challenge, and everyone plays a role, the end result is more effective. Everyone, not just the government, needs to be involved in a systematic effort to keep the nation safe from harm and resilient when struck by hazards like natural disasters, acts of terrorism, and pandemics." End quote. The National Preparedness System is simply a system whereby the United States of America, throughout multiple presidencies, multiple administrations of multiple flavors of politics, but even stepping outside of government and politics throughout the entire community, is a system whereby we strive to reach the national preparedness goal, which is simply this, quote, "a secure and resilient nation," end quote, through all levels of society. And we're going to look specifically at how Skywarn fits within the national preparedness goal when we align ourselves within the National Incident Management System. So, in summary, what is NIMS? It's an organized approach for achieving the goal of national preparedness for emergencies and disasters, as well as planned events of all types and all scales, in other words, all sizes. It can be used for a single motor vehicle accident. It could be used for planning a wedding. It could be used, and not implying, by the way, that weddings are disasters, rather simply a planned event. NIMS can be used for a whole variety of things. It can be used for the massive oil spill or Hurricane Katrina or something like that in past history. It can be used for two vehicles colliding with each other on the highway, creating a traffic accident. It can be used for so much, both within the government and within the private sector as well. It is simply, again, to repeat one more time, an organized approach for achieving the goal of national preparedness for emergencies, disasters, and planned events of all types and all scales. So, having now grasped a basic understanding of what NIMS is, what are the fundamental three principles of the National Incident Management System? NIMS has three governing principles: resource management, command and coordination, and communication and information management. What are these three principles? What specifically do they mean, and how would they apply within the context of a local Skywarn team, such as Kent County Skywarn? Well, in looking at the first principle, resource management, resource management within NIMS looks not only at how you handle resources, which could be equipment, it could be volunteers, it could be public agency professionals, first responders, it could be vehicles, it could be any number of things that could be defined as resources, not only during an incident or during a time of active response, but also prior to that as well. Looking at how you prepare and manage those resources such that when you need to actively respond, you can do so most effectively. But sometimes, no matter how well prepared you are, you have to call upon mutual aid. So, for example, mutual aid within the National Incident Management System looks at aid between local agencies, such as two local fire departments. It looks at mutual aid between states. It looks at mutual aid between states and the federal government, such as, for example, here within Michigan, the Michigan Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. But it's not simply Michigan. For example, commonly this time of year, and even about a few weeks prior to time of recording, the FEMA agency, as well as the Florida Division of Emergency Management, often are very closely aligned with each other because they are often responding to these significant hurricanes that impact Florida. It's not relegated just to Florida or Michigan, it's used all throughout the United States. So, the first principle, once again, is resource management. Managing resources both before and during an incident, and when you are no longer able to respond effectively at your level, you then escalate for mutual aid to the next highest level. All response begins and ends locally. So, for example, if a county is responding and their resources are inadequate to respond, say to a tornado, they may call upon the governor of the state to send state resources. If the state resources are insufficient, then the governor of the state may reach out to the president of the United States and request FEMA resources. For example, down once again at the micro level, if one fire department is responding to a structure fire and they need more resources, they may, and this happens all the time, they may call upon a neighboring fire department to offer mutual aid. And this happens frequently in the area of Michigan in which I work. Not necessarily structure fires, although that's not as uncommon as might be thought, but simply the mutual aid and cooperation between local agencies. The second principle of NIMS is command and coordination. And this is where the incident command system ICS fits within. We'll look at that once again more in the following video. Command and coordination encompasses management characteristics. And while this is a long list of characteristics, each one is vitally important. First and foremost, common terminology, particularly important for volunteer radio communicators who may utilize amateur radio or the general mobile radio service. Or if they are asked to volunteer using public safety radio systems, it's very, very important to operate with common terminology. For example, in a Skywarn context, if I say that 0 to 1 SRH values have increased from 50 meters squared per second squared to 400 meters squared per second squared, do I know what I mean? Yes, I do. Will some of you listening to this know exactly what I mean and what the hazard would therefore be from that? Yes. But many of you, through no fault of your own, simply because you're not familiar with that jargon, because I'm not using terminology, may have no idea what I just said. And that's perfectly fine. It's not due to lack of intelligence, it's due to unfamiliarity with jargon. That is why we use common terminology. What I said was surface level winds are now, how would sometimes it's harder to restate something in common terminology than it is to use jargon. Let me try one more time. Surface level winds are now increasing in speed and also increasing cross directionally, such that surface level rotation within thunderstorms is much more likely, meaning the hazard for a tornado developing from a severe thunderstorm is much more imminent. That was more common terminology than the previous statement. Truthfully, if I spent more time on that example, I could probably and should probably make that even more clear. But nevertheless, that's an idea of what common terminology is. It doesn't matter how well you know what you're talking about if people don't understand what it is you're saying. And that's going to vary group by group. So, for example, we within Skywarn, if we are within a planning phase within ICS, we very well may use those advanced meteorological terms when looking at forecasting. But when we are in the middle of an active incident response, that terminology, when we have a large number of trained weather spotters, when we may have other Skywarn teams or served agencies listening to us, that common terminology is no longer common to the audience that is now listening to us. And so we need to adapt it and we need to use the common terminology to the group to which we are talking. That's why, for example, within Skywarn, I do not recommend using Q codes that you can find from amateur radio, such as QSL or QSY. Amateur radio operators often know what that means, but QSL, copy, QSY, change frequencies. Again, we need to eliminate jargon and use common terminology when providing command and coordination. As you could probably tell, I could talk a very long time on this particular one, but we need to move on to the next characteristic, which is modular organization. And we're going to see this especially in part two, looking at the incident command system. Modular organization simply means that we create the positions that we need. We don't create the positions that we don't need, but as can often happen, as we continue to respond, we add more and more positions. But as we start to gain control of the incident response, we start to scale some of the positions back that we no longer need. We're going to look at very specific ways that modular organization can and should be applied to Skyward, not only at a county level, but theoretically also at an area-wide level as well. We're going to save that for part two. Characteristic number three, management by objectives. You need to know what target you need to hit or you're not going to hit anything. Some people will say that if you don't exactly know how to shoot for the moon, at least you'll find yourself among the stars, when in reality is if you don't know how to do that, you're just going to find yourself lost in space. We need to define what the objectives are. For example, within Skywarn, we need to clearly define the objectives for a severe weather response. For example, let's define three objectives really quickly. Objective number one, gather all trained weather reports from trained Skywarn spotters who check into a Skywarn net. Objective number two, appoint radar analysts to analyze live radar conditions and relay that to the net control operator and the Skywarn weather spotters who have checked into that Skywarn net. Objective number three, ensure that all radio transmissions are properly logged and properly categorized based upon their type, such as a net check-in, a weather report, a severe weather report, and so on and so forth. That is management by objectives. More formally, management by objectives can and should turn into incident action planning, writing up formal IAPs or incident action plans. We're going to look at that to some very basic levels within part two. We're not really going to dive a whole lot into the details of writing IAPs in either video. However, there are definitely resources you can look at. Suffice it to say, everybody should at least have a very basic understanding of what an incident action plan is. It's a formal document that is in a standardized format that transcends agencies, whereby you can look at it, determine the objectives, and you should be able to determine where you fit within the incident response. And if you don't, certainly then your supervisor, whoever that might be, can certainly help you with that. Incident facilities and staging, that one may not apply so much to a Skywarn team whereby Skywarn spotters are operating from their home locations, but nevertheless, for some types of incident response, such as hurricanes or disaster relief or motor vehicle accidents or pandemic response, you absolutely will set up specific facilities and stage people and equipment and resources to best respond to that active incident. But as we talked about as well, you need to have comprehensive resource management. You need to keep track of things. You need to keep your paperwork in order. There is a lot of paperwork involved within the National Incident Management System and the Incident Command System. The good news is if you don't enjoy paperwork, you don't have to be the one that does it. You may have to do some, and it is good to know how to read various forms. Some people particularly enjoy that administrative planning function. I happen to enjoy that, but not everybody does. All that having been said, the ideas behind all that is simply to comprehensively manage your resources. For example, on a Skyward net, a very basic example of that would be just to have a log of everybody that has checked into your Skyward net. So you know who is listening on the air, you know where they are at within your area that you are monitoring severe weather. Integrated communications, another topic that could certainly spawn a lot of further discussion. Integrated communications simply looks at how do you get people to communicate with each other. It's a lot easier to coordinate incident response when everybody is on the same wavelength, in some cases, literally by being on the same radio frequency or using the same type of communication systems. For example, Skywarn, if nobody knows what repeater to listen to or where to go during a severe thunderstorm warning, you're probably not going to have a very effective Skywarn response. You need to ensure that you have integrated communications for success. Continuing on in our list of NIMS management characteristics, establishment and transfer of command is very important. Within the world of public safety, this could look something like a firefighter transferring command to his fire chief, his or her fire chief, as the incident grows in duration, complexity, or scope. For Skywarn, it could be looking at something as simple as handing off net control operations to another net controller. We're going to look at how a net controller fits within the incident command system. But all that having been said, people need to know who is in the command structure and if a command, or rather, if an incident response goes into a new operational period, we'll talk about that more in part two, who is going to be running the incident response when the current operational period ends. Again, to make it very simple for Skywarn, if you have a net controller that needs to hand off responsibilities of command for that net, how and to whom are they going to hand that responsibility? That would be what establishment and transfer of command looks like at a very basic level. Unified Command may not so much be in scope for a county Skywarn team. Unified Command is more when you have multiple agencies all coordinating incident response. But especially if you have an area-wide Skywarn group that is helping manage the response of smaller local Skywarn teams, Unified Command may very well come into play. Chain of command and unity of command simply means that there is a very clearly defined structure in which all of the resources work, whether we're talking public safety resources or volunteer resources. Accountability just means that, and practically it means if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen, but more broadly than that, it simply means that you are accountable to your supervisor to accomplish the task set before you. Dispatch and deployment is hugely important, and this is one of the critical areas in which Skywarn spotting differs very much from storm chasing, in that Skywarn spotting will typically have someone from the command unit of a Skywarn team reach out to team members and deploy them. And for some teams, that may mean sending mobile spotters out in the field. For our team currently, we do not do that for safety and liability reasons. But it may mean deploying resources by asking everyone to get on a local frequency, to start checking into a net run by a net controller, and to be ready to give severe weather reports should severe weather strike. Something like storm chasing, for example, is where someone often independently of any other group or individual decides to go and try and chase a storm for various reasons. Without commenting on the rightness or wrongness of that, that's something that falls outside the command and coordination principle of NIMS and outside the management characteristic of the National Incident Management System, and not something that we in any way would encourage within Skywarn, and even teams that have mobile spotters would not encourage that either. You are accountable to someone for what you do. You are a reflection on the broader team. We are a reflection on the broader team. I, as a coordinator, am a reflection on my served agencies. And so we deploy when we are requested to do so. We do not self deploy. Information and intelligence management looks at how you manage all your information. Intelligence often refers to the situation unit or the investigation unit within the incident command system. Not so much going to dive into greater detail with that, but nevertheless can be helpful to be aware of. ICS characteristics are again the application of command and coordination from the National Incident Management System. ICS can consist of command staff and general staff, as well as at the most fundamental level, your resources. Resources could be, in a Skywarn context, a trained weather spotter.
It could be a member of the public who hasn't had verifiable Skywarn training, but nevertheless is reporting pea-sized hail from their location. Resources within the National Incident Management System, especially when someone needs to order a resource, whether it be personnel, equipment, or whatever it might be, they're often typed, meaning, for example, you can order a specific type of personnel, you can order a specific type of equipment, and so on and so forth. Let's say, for example, that I am a Skywarn team leader and my particular responsibility is ensuring that mobile Skywarn spotters who are very well trained in safety and severe weather spotting, who are only going to operate within the confines of the area for which the team is responsible, I need to equip them with radios that are all able to talk on the same repeater. That would be a type of resource that I may need to, quote, order. I may not need to pay for it, but I may need to request it from someone, such as 2 meter and 70 centimeter analog radios that operate within VHF and UHF, regardless of the brand. Personnel can also be typed as well within them, such as the AUX-C, which is simply the abbreviation for auxiliary communicator. That is the official volunteer communications position that is both the local and the state training standard now within Michigan and within Kent County. Auxcom is a program of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, requires extensive training and is actually the only official typed resource for an amateur radio operator, but is an absolutely wonderful means by which to receive training and exercise not only your amateur radio skills in service of your community and agencies, but also communication skills at large. Looking at more detail within ICS characteristics, we can break it down by command staff, such as the incident commander, often simply known as the IC. Not as common these days, but the Deputy Incident Commander, a liaison officer responsible for interfacing between the team and other agencies. So, for example, a net controller may serve in multiple functions within the command staff. They may be serving as incident commander and the liaison officer, appointing liaisons between various county nets and their home net. A public information officer is always by default going to be your incident commander, or it's going to be someone the incident commander appoints, especially if you're dealing with the media or outside organizations, including social media as well, by the way. Is also some teams will have a safety officer, ensuring that everything is done safely and according to established procedures and protocols. You can also have general staff, such as chiefs, directors, supervisors, and resources. We're going to look at that again in more detail in part two. Also within NIMS, as part of the communication and, or rather the communication or the command and coordination principle, getting ahead of myself to the third principle there. Still on the second principle, command and coordination, EOCs or emergency operation centers fit within command and coordination, especially the coordination part. EOCs are often divided into staff organizational structures by departments. An EOC, for example, often is built out within a departmental structure, whereas an ICP, an incident command post, is often built out within a standard FLOP structure, finance, logistics, operations, planning. But that can vary depending on the size of the incident, where in the country you may be working in the established emergency operations plans of your served agencies. Emergency operations centers specifically fulfill the coordination function, whereas the ICP often fulfills the command function within NIMS. Emergency management coordinators often are those that decide when an EOC activates and deactivates. And EOCs can be both at a county level, they can be at a state level as well too. Here in Michigan, the state EOC is in Lansing, the capital of our state. You can also have multi-agency coordination groups such as MAC groups. And again, turning to FEMA definitions once more, FEMA states, quote, regarding multi-agency coordination groups, quote, multi-agency coordination is a process that allows all levels of government and all disciplines to work together more efficiently and effectively. A max is often initiated when there are multiple jurisdictions, multiple agencies, and possibly multiple events. Examples of max are state, local, or tribal emergency operations centers, EOCs. End quote. In other words, when you start involving multiple teams, how are you going to get all of those teams to play nicely together, work on the same objectives, integrate their communication so they can all talk to each other to ultimately respond to that incident? How are you going to do that well? That's where Max can step in. Finally, here, the final characteristic of command and coordination from NIMS is the Joint Information System, or JIS. FEMA states, quote, GIS integrates incident information and public affairs into a unified organization that provides consistent, coordinated, accurate, accessible, timely, and complete information to the public and stakeholders during incident operations, end quote. That is the second principle, command and coordination. Turning to the final principle now of NIMS, communication and information management. Communications management looks at standardizing communications types, maintaining equipment standards, and providing proper training and certification in utilizing equipment. For example, with public safety systems, they need to ensure that their first responders are utilizing radios that can meet current encryption standards. If a first responder is trying to use a secure channel and has a radio that is too old to support the current encryption requirement, that could provide an information security or even an operational security concern. Within the Skywarn context, for example, if we have trained weather spotters, they need to be trained in knowing how to use their radios at a basic level, how to check into a net, proper radio discipline and net protocol, proper Skywarn weather incident reporting, such as time, event, location, and so on and so forth. Incident information, often handled by either the command unit in larger incidents, if a planning section is built out, the planning section will handle these, the incident reports, as well as the IAPs, or the incident action plans. Here in Kent County Skywarn, we don't typically build out a separate planning section per se that does the IAPs for us. So far, incident action planning has been a function primarily of myself and then the three deputy coordinators that I am privileged to serve with in service of Kent County. Communication and information management also sets communication standards and formats. Once again, harkening back to one of our earlier principles of ensuring common terminology is in use, and also something we haven't looked at a whole lot yet in this video series, or in this video course this evening, interoperable communications. If I have an older Motorola VHF radio, if I have a Baofeng UV5R, if I have a Yaesu FT70D, if I have an Anytone 878 handheld transceiver, how can I ensure that all those different radios from all those different brands can talk to each other so that the team can hear people who don't necessarily use the same brand of radio? Radios where the power level may be very, very different. You might have someone with a handheld radio that's outputting 5 watts, or you might have someone with a larger radio on a desk that's outputting 50 watts. You might have someone in a vehicle with a radio that's outputting 25 watts or 50 watts. How do you ensure that all those different types of radios can talk to each other? That's where the principle of interoperability comes in. In a Skywarn context, for example, you would tell your volunteers, we are going to utilize this VHF repeater or UHF repeater, or if you're operating with a public safety system, this talk group, such as a special event talk group, so that everyone knows how to talk to each other and they can interoperate regardless of the brand, the power level, and so on and so forth. Plain language goes hand in hand with common terminology. For example, if I say that we have a fast approaching quasi-linear convective system, again, I know what I mean by that language, and some of you listening will know exactly what I mean by that language. But others of you, again, through absolutely no fault in intelligence, but simply unfamiliarity with the jargon I am using, may not know exactly what I mean. So instead, if I use plain language and say we have a fast approaching squall line, I would dare say that everybody knows what I mean by a squall line, a linear line of storms that often can produce wind damage. Communication standards and formats also encompass technology use and procedures, especially in today's world where cybersecurity is increasingly a concern in terms of how technology use and procedures pertain to information security and also operational security as well too. Now, in a Skywarn context, much of Skywarn operations throughout the United States are done either within the context of amateur radio or GMRS. Nothing is particularly private, nor does it need to be. Skywarn is not a search and rescue organization that does need to maintain information security and operational security. For example, if you're running a search and rescue organization affiliated with a sheriff's department, you absolutely do need to maintain informational security and operational security. You don't necessarily want the general public walking into your incident command post and causing confusion or chaos. You want to have a way to control that. You also don't want people just simply asking about the status of someone that you found, especially if they are a minor or if they are elderly or if they are at risk, whatever it might be. You need to maintain informational security and operational security in that context. For Skywarn, those don't necessarily apply as much because everybody is looking at the same clouds that we do. We just need to make sure that we're looking at them and we can do so in a trained manner. But some things pertaining to Skywarn, such as membership lists and information passed to serve agencies, may be within the umbrella of information security and operational security. So, as we draw to a close, why does Kent County Skywarn, why do Skywarn teams, I believe in general, need to align with the National Incident Management System? The National Incident Management System presents the standardized approach to incident management throughout the United States. And our served agencies, especially for Kent County, the National Weather Service, and our local emergency management agency, their operations are all conducted within the National Incident Management System structure. This is the world in which they live. It is the world in which we need to live also. Skywarn teams especially need the following characteristics of NIMS. There's a couple that you'll see here that don't always apply to Skywarn, but the ones I will now list, I believe, always apply to Skywarn. Whether you're talking about an isolated thunderstorm that lasts for 20 minutes or you're talking about a long-lived tornado outbreak. Skywarn teams and Kent County Skywarn, we need these characteristics. We need common terminology. We need modular organization. We need management by objectives. We need incident action planning. We need manageable span of control, which I did not touch on that one earlier. That one simply means being able to effectively control the resources assigned to you and then adding more people to manage additional resources as the volunteer pool or the first responder pool continues to increase. Comprehensive resource management, integrated communications, establishment and transfer of command, chain of command and unity of command, accountability, deployment, and information and intelligence management. These are all characteristics that we as a Kent County Skywarn leadership team continue to work to align all of our team operations, our mission and vision within. And I would encourage other Skywarn teams, if they have not yet considered doing that, to do that as well. The specific application and outworking of that may differ county by county, but nevertheless, the principles would remain the same. And then, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in a Skywarn context, incident facilities and locations and unified command may not apply for a county level team, but for other organizations and missions, they certainly would. Skywarn teams need to align with NIMS in order to effectively serve their local agencies and National Weather Service offices, to promote interoperability between Skywarn spotters and Skywarn teams, to align their operations as part of whole community preparedness to achieve the national preparedness goal, to align our operations, our planning, our logistics, our administration into the same system that partner agencies and served agencies, both public and private sector, utilize, and to best position teams for success in an ever-changing world where national preparedness is more important than it has ever been. That is why Kent County Skywarn is aligning everything we can within the National Incident Management System, ultimately, no matter how small of a part it may be at times, that we can serve as a community of trained spotters to effectively serve our local agencies to achieve whole community preparedness as part of the national preparedness goal. In closing, what are some additional education opportunities that you can take? I would recommend that you take these following FEMA independent study courses: IS or Independent Study 100, Introduction to the Incident Command System; IS 200, Basic Incident Command System for Initial Response; IS 700, An Introduction to the National Incident Management System; and IS 800, the National Response Framework and Introduction. With that, I hope to see all of the viewers in part two, where we look at Skywarn and the incident command system, specifically looking at incident command positions and structures for various levels of Skywarn severe weather incident response. And I hope that this video was helpful in gaining a basic understanding of the National Incident Management System. Any questions, certainly feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you are a Kent County Skywarn team member, please always feel free to reach out at any time to the Kent County Skywarn leadership email. We are here to serve our community, to serve our agencies, and to serve our team members to best position all of us to align within the National Incident Management System so that we can effectively meet the national preparedness goal. Thank you all, and I hope to see you in the next video.